The wagon rattled to a stop in front of the weathered ranch house, and Margaret stepped down onto the dusty ground with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a heart full of shattered hopes. The driver had already explained it to her twice during the long ride from town. The man who'd sent for her, James Hartley, had married someone else 3 weeks ago, found himself a widow from the neighboring county, and didn't have the decency to send word before Margaret had traveled all the way from Missouri. "I'm real sorry, miss," the driver said, tipping his hat. "But there ain't another wagon heading back to town until next week. Mr. Dalton here. He's agreed to let you stay in his spare room until then." Margaret looked at the house before her. It was a simple structure, 2 stories with a sagging porch and shutters that hung slightly crooked. The paint had long since surrendered to the relentless Texas sun. A chicken coop stood off to one side, and beyond that, she could see endless stretches of brown grass dotted with cattle. A tall man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. He had the look of someone who'd been carved from the very landscape itself, all hard angles and sun-weathered skin, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. "Miss Patterson?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. "Yes. Margaret Patterson. Thomas Dalton. My daughter's inside. I hope you don't mind children." "Not at all." He nodded once, picked up her bag without asking, and headed toward the house. Margaret followed, her traveling dress collecting dust with every step. Inside, the house told the story of a man doing his best and falling short. Dishes were piled in the basin. Dust covered every surface. A small sock lay abandoned on the stairs. The whole place had the hollow feeling of a home that had forgotten how to be one. "Sarah!" Thomas called up the stairs. "Come down here, please." A little girl appeared at the top of the steps, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and her father's gray eyes. She wore a dress that was clean but wrinkled, and her feet were bare. "This is Miss Patterson. She'll be staying in your mama's old sewing room for a few days." The child studied Margaret with the unnerving directness that only children possess. "Are you going to marry my daddy?" "Sarah." Thomas's ears reddened. "That's not. Miss Patterson is just staying here because there was a mix-up in town. She'll be leaving next week." Margaret knelt down to the girl's level. "I'm pleased to meet you, Sarah. And no, I'm not marrying your daddy. I was supposed to marry someone else, but he changed his mind." "That wasn't very nice of him." "No, it wasn't." Sarah descended the stairs carefully, gripping the railing. "My mama died when I was little. I don't remember her much. Daddy says she was beautiful." "I'm sure she was." Thomas cleared his throat. "I'll show you to your room, Miss Patterson. Sarah, go wash up for supper." The sewing room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the western hills. Thomas set her bag down and stood awkwardly in the doorway. "I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Dalton." "Thomas. And it's no trouble. I'll be making supper in about an hour. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread." After he left, Margaret sat on the bed and allowed herself one moment of complete despair. She'd sold everything she owned to come west. She'd read James Hartley's letters so many times she'd memorized them. She'd imagined her new life in such vivid detail that arriving to find it erased felt like waking from a beautiful dream into a nightmare. But Margaret Patterson had never been one to wallow. Her mother used to say she had grit enough for 3 women. So she unpacked her few belongings, washed her face in the basin, and went downstairs to see if she could help with supper. She found Thomas in the kitchen, staring at a pot of beans that had clearly burned to the bottom. Sarah sat at the table, drawing pictures on a slate. "Mr. Dalton, Thomas, would you mind if I took over the cooking? It's the least I can do to thank you for your kindness." He looked at her with something close to relief. "You sure? You just got here." "I'm sure." "Why don't you go tend to whatever needs tending, and I'll call you when it's ready." He hesitated, then nodded and headed back outside. Margaret tied on an apron she found hanging by the door and assessed the situation. The beans were a loss, but she found more in the pantry, along with some salt pork, an onion, and various other supplies. The cornbread batter Thomas had started was lumpy and too thick. She started over. "Can I help?" Sarah had appeared at her elbow. "Of course. Can you set the table?" While Sarah carefully placed 3 plates and forks, Margaret worked. She'd been cooking since she was old enough to reach the stove. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, dicing the salt pork, sautéing it with the onion, adding the beans and some water and a bay leaf she found in a jar. She mixed up fresh cornbread and slid it into the oven. "You're good at this," Sarah observed. "I've had a lot of practice. Do you help your father with the cooking?" "Sometimes. But he's not very good at it. He can make beans and cornbread and that's about it. Sometimes the beans are crunchy and sometimes they're mushy. And once he made biscuits that were hard as rocks. We had to throw them out for the chickens and even they wouldn't eat them." Margaret laughed, and the sound surprised her. She hadn't expected to laugh today. When Thomas came in an hour later, he stopped in the doorway and stared. The kitchen was clean. The table was set with plates and cups, and in the center sat a vase holding wildflowers that Sarah had picked. The smell of properly cooked beans and fresh cornbread filled the air. "Something wrong?" Margaret asked. "No. It's been a while since the house smelled like this." They sat down to eat, and Margaret watched Thomas take his first bite. His expression shifted from wariness to surprise to something that looked almost like pain. "This is wonderful," he said quietly. "It's just beans and cornbread. It's the best beans and cornbread I've ever had." Sarah kicked her feet under the table. "See, Daddy? I told you she was good at cooking." After supper, Margaret insisted on washing the dishes while Thomas took Sarah upstairs for bed. She could hear him reading to the girl, his rough voice stumbling over the words. When he came back down, he found Margaret wiping down the kitchen table. "You don't have to do all this," he said. "I know. But I need to keep busy, or I'll just sit and think about what a fool I've been." Thomas poured himself coffee and sat at the table. After a moment, he poured a second cup and slid it toward her. Margaret accepted it gratefully and took the seat across from him. "You're not a fool," he said. "Hartley's the fool. Any man who'd let you go is. You don't even know me. I know you traveled all this way on the promise of a man you'd never met. That takes courage. And I know you made my daughter smile more tonight than she has in months. That counts for something." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking their coffee while the darkness pressed against the windows and somewhere outside a coyote howled at the rising moon. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the smell of burned coffee. She dressed quickly and found Thomas in the kitchen, looking defeated. "I was trying to let you sleep in," he explained. "I appreciate the thought. Why don't you go do your morning chores, and I'll make breakfast." She scrambled eggs with cheese and made proper biscuits, which Sarah declared were better than clouds. Thomas ate 3 of them without saying a word, but his eyes spoke volumes. After breakfast, Margaret found herself with nothing to do. The wagon wouldn't come for another 6 days. 6 long days of being useless in a stranger's house. So she asked Thomas if she could do some cleaning, and he gave her a look of such desperate gratitude that she had to turn away. She started in the kitchen, scrubbing years of accumulated grime from the stove and the counters. Sarah helped, chattering constantly about her chickens and her pony and the baby calf that had been born last month. The girl was starved for female company, that much was clear. Margaret found herself telling stories about growing up in Missouri, about her 5 younger siblings and the farm where she'd learned to cook and clean and make something out of nothing. "Why did you want to leave?" Sarah asked. "My parents died of fever 2 years ago. My older brother got the farm, and his wife didn't much want me around. I thought starting fresh somewhere new would be better than staying somewhere I wasn't wanted." "That's sad." "Yes. But sometimes sad things lead to better things." By midday, the kitchen gleamed. Margaret moved to the parlor, which was in even worse shape. She swept and dusted and organized, finding little treasures as she worked, a carved wooden horse, a woman's hair comb, a photograph of Thomas with a pretty blonde woman who must have been Sarah's mother. When Thomas came in for lunch, he stopped in his tracks. "Good Lord. Is it all right? I hope I didn't overstep." All right. Miss Patterson, I forgot the parlor could look like this. She made sandwiches from the leftover pork and some bread she'd baked that morning. They ate on the porch, watching the cattle graze in the distance. How long have you been ranching? Margaret asked. All my life. This was my father's place. He died 5 years ago, left it to me. Lost my wife, Emma, 3 years ago. Complications from Sarah's birth caught up with her. Doctor said her heart just gave out. He stared at his hands. Been just me and Sarah since then. It must be difficult, running a ranch alone. I manage. Got a couple of hands that come help during busy seasons. But day to day, it's just me. And you're doing everything, the ranch work, the housework, raising Sarah. Doing a poor job of most of it, if I'm honest. I think you're doing better than you give yourself credit for. Sarah's a wonderful child. His face softened when she mentioned his daughter. She is. She's the only thing that kept me going after Emma died. The afternoon passed in similar fashion. Margaret found more things to clean and organize. She mended a tear in Sarah's dress and sewed a button back onto Thomas's shirt. She baked bread for the next few days and started a pot of stew for supper. That evening, after another good meal and after Sarah had gone to bed, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. I don't know how to thank you, Thomas said. You've done more in one day than I manage in a month. It's nice to feel useful, and it keeps my mind off my troubles. Have you thought about what you'll do when you get back to town? Try to find work, I suppose. Save enough for passage back east. Though I'm not sure what's waiting for me there either. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. There's not much work in town for a woman alone. Especially not respectable work. Margaret knew what he meant. A woman without family or marriage prospects didn't have many options in a frontier town. The thought made her stomach tighten with anxiety. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Margaret rose early, made breakfast, cleaned, cooked, and tended to the house and Sarah while Thomas worked the ranch. Each evening they ate together, and each evening the conversation came a little easier. Margaret learned that Thomas had fought in the war, that his limp came from a bullet that had shattered his femur at Shiloh. She told him about her childhood, about learning to read from her mother and to cook from her grandmother. Sarah bloomed under the attention. Her hair was brushed and braided each morning. Her dresses were clean and mended. She helped with the cooking and the cleaning, learning and laughing. The house began to feel alive again, warm in ways that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. On the 5th day, Margaret was in the kitchen making preserves from some berries Sarah had found when she heard raised voices outside. She looked out the window to see Thomas talking with a man on horseback, a man she recognized with a sick feeling in her stomach. James Hartley. She stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. There you are. James called out. He was handsome in a slick sort of way, with dark hair pomaded back and a mustache waxed to points. I've been looking everywhere for you, Margaret. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Thomas looked at her, then at James, his expression unreadable. What misunderstanding would that be? Margaret asked coolly. That business with Catherine, it was a mistake. She and I aren't suited at all. I realize now that you're the woman I should have married. I've come to make things right. Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her. She could see Sarah peering around the doorframe, listening. You're a week too late, Mr. Hartley. Now don't be like that. I know I hurt you, and I apologize. But we can still have our life together. I've got the house all ready for you, just like I wrote in my letters. You have the house ready for the woman you chose over me. The woman you married. That's done with. She's moved back to her sister's place. Come on, Margaret. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Margaret looked at this man who'd occupied her dreams for months. She'd imagined him tall and strong and honorable. The reality was so much smaller. No. What do you mean, no? I mean I'm not going anywhere with you, Mr. Hartley. You made your choice, and I'm making mine. James's face darkened. You can't stay here. It ain't proper, a single woman living in a bachelor's house. She's my guest, Thomas said quietly, but there was steel underneath the words. And she can stay as long as she likes. This ain't right, Dalton. Folks will talk. Let them talk. James looked between them, and something mean flickered in his eyes. I see how it is. You work fast, Margaret. Got your hooks into another man already. Thomas took a step forward, and despite his limp, there was something dangerous in the movement. I think you'd better leave. This ain't over. Yeah, it is. James wheeled his horse around and galloped off, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. Margaret realized she was shaking. Thomas touched her elbow gently. You all right? Yes. I can't believe I almost married him. You're better than him. Better than this whole damn town, if you ask me. She looked up at him, at this quiet, decent man who'd shown her more kindness in 5 days than James Hartley had in 6 months of letters. Thank you, she said, for standing up for me. Nothing to thank me for. That evening, Sarah was subdued at dinner. She pushed her food around her plate and kept glancing at Margaret with worried eyes. What's wrong, sweetheart? Margaret asked. Are you going to leave tomorrow? Margaret had forgotten. Tomorrow was when the wagon was supposed to come. Tomorrow she was supposed to go back to town. I suppose I am. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But you can't. You're making everything better. The house is happy again, and Daddy smiles now, and I don't want you to go. Sarah, Thomas began. Please, Miss Margaret. Please stay. You could marry Daddy and be my mama and we could be a family. That's enough, Thomas said, but his voice was gentle. Miss Patterson has her own life. She can't just stay here because we want her to. Sarah ran from the table, her footsteps thundering up the stairs. A door slammed. Margaret and Thomas sat in uncomfortable silence. I'm sorry, he finally said. She shouldn't have said that. She's just a child. She doesn't understand. No, but she's right. Thomas looked at her across the table, his eyes serious. The house is happier. I'm happier. And I'll be damned if I let you go back to that town with no prospects and no future when there's a perfectly good life waiting for you here. Margaret's heart began to race. Thomas, I know we've only known each other a few days. I know this is crazy. But Emma used to say that sometimes God puts people exactly where they need to be. You were supposed to marry Hartley, but he turned you away, and you ended up here. With us. That feels like more than just coincidence. What are you saying? I'm saying stay. Not as a guest, but as my wife. I can't offer you romance or poetry. I'm just a simple rancher with a limp and a daughter and a house that falls apart faster than I can fix it. But I can offer you a home. A place where you're wanted. A family. Margaret looked around the kitchen that she'd scrubbed until it shined. She thought about Sarah upstairs, crying into her pillow. She thought about waking up every morning with purpose, with people who needed her, with a life that felt real and solid and good. I don't love you, she said honestly. I don't love you either. Not yet. But I respect you. I admire you. And I think, given time, love might come. Emma and I grew to love each other. We married because her father and mine thought it was a good match, but we made it into something real. And if it doesn't, if we never love each other, then we'll have partnership and respect and a good life anyway. That's more than a lot of people get. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening land. She could see the barn where Thomas kept his horses, the fields where his cattle grazed, the vast sky that went on forever. This was nothing like the life she'd imagined in Missouri. It was harder, rougher, more uncertain. It was also real. She turned back to Thomas. I'll stay. The relief on his face was almost painful to see. He stood, then seemed uncertain what to do next. We could go to town tomorrow, he said. Get the preacher to marry us proper. That would be good. I'll do right by you, Margaret. I promise. I believe you. There was a creak from upstairs, and they both looked up. Sarah was sitting on the landing, her face pressed between the railings. Did she say yes? The girl whispered. Thomas smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face. She said yes. Sarah let out a whoop that probably scared the chickens and came flying down the stairs. She threw herself at Margaret, wrapping her arms around her waist. You're going to be my mama. Margaret knelt down and hugged the child properly. If you'll have me. I will. I will. Can I call you Mama? Or should I call you Miss Margaret? Or... Whoa there, Thomas said, laughing. How about we figure all that out tomorrow? Right now, it's way past your bedtime. Sarah groaned but obeyed, giving Margaret one more quick hug before running upstairs. Margaret could hear her singing to herself as she got ready for bed. Thomas walked Margaret to the bottom of the stairs. I know this is all sudden. Everything in my life has been sudden lately. At least this kind of sudden feels right. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Margaret climbed the stairs to her small room. She stood at the window for a long time, looking out at her new home. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. A cool breeze carried the smell of sage and dust and possibility. She'd come west to marry a stranger. She was still going to marry a stranger. But this time, it felt like a beginning rather than a mistake. The next morning, they rode to town in the wagon. Thomas, Margaret, and Sarah, who couldn't stop bouncing on the seat. The preacher married them in his parlor with his wife and daughter as witnesses. Margaret wore her best dress, and Thomas had slicked his hair back with water. It wasn't the wedding she'd once imagined, with flowers and music and all her family around her. It was better. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed her carefully on the cheek. Sarah clapped so hard her hands must have hurt. They bought supplies and headed home. Their home. Margaret kept testing the words in her mind. Their home. Her husband. Her daughter. That evening, Margaret made a special dinner to celebrate. After Sarah had gone to bed, she and Thomas sat on the porch in the gentle darkness. No regrets? He asked. Not yet. Ask me again in 50 years. He smiled. That's a deal. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. After a time, Thomas reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused and rough, but his grip was gentle. Thank you, he said, for staying. Thank you for asking. High above them, stars wheeled across the endless Texas sky. Inside the house, everything was clean and ordered and ready for tomorrow. Upstairs, Sarah slept soundly, her prayers answered. It wasn't the life Margaret had planned. It was better. It was real. It was hers. And somewhere in the darkness, the house seemed to settle into itself with a sigh of contentment, as if it too knew that it was finally, completely home.